I'm Marc Suchard. Amongst our 193 new friends, I'd like to introduce you to one of them. This is Yeesuk Kim. He is an orthopedic surgeon from Hongnong University, and how we got involved together will be made clear as we go through this talk. Earlier this year, the OHDSI community once again started on a small adventure. And this adventure was to demonstrate our capacity as a whole community to really address critical questions from the very beginning to the very end. Could we take a clinical question from the design stages through its execution all the way through to providing clinical answers in a time period where, as a community, we could redo this daunting task over and over again across different clinical questions once we've built the infrastructure to begin to promote healthcare decisions and improve health. At the leadership retreat in February, I hypothesized that given our diverse clinical and academic and technical backgrounds, as a community, we could come together to answer a clinical question in under 1 month. To engage the community and gather some excitement, we put out an announcement in early March that we were looking for clinical questions that could help demonstrate the diversity, the effectiveness, and the capacity of the community. From this announcement, we received 16 different submissions of clinical questions across the globe from the US, from Europe, and from Asia. It was very tough to pick just one question to begin to develop this capacity. And I hope the other 15 are already underway or looking for partners to become underway to fulfill their own clinical questions. We picked a specific question that was submitted by Yeesuk because it involved both a comparative effectiveness and a drug safety question. We began work on this study on March 21st. We had weekly teleconference demonstrations of what we were doing for the whole community so they could follow along. And within that month period, before April 17th, all but one of our data partners had returned their results, and we had compiled these results together. Those participating with us were more than 19 different participants from this community. And I'd like to give a shout out to a couple of those. For example, Wojciech from the NIH provided great insight in data integrity and our design. Chan from Aju University provided extensive feedback on the protocol. In terms of our data partners, Peng from Columbia provided the Columbia EHR data results. Christoph from the University of New Mexico provided claims data results from 2 different Truven databases. Rohit from Stanford provided us with EHR information from Stride. Yang Hui from the University of Texas participated as a data partner for their Cerner EHR. And Hui from Quintiles was instrumental in bringing together Intile's P+ database.
I'm Yeesuk. Nice to meet you, all of you. Several years ago, a 60-year female has just showed up in ER and with a hip fracture. After play, her grandson playfully pushed her and she fell. As you can see the femoral neck fracture, and she was not so old, and the fracture was fracture was minimally displaced, so urgent internal fixation was indicated. So I did the surgery at 2 a.m. After surgery, I checked the bone densitometry, and as you see, the osteoporosis was diagnosed, and I decided to start the anti-osteoporotic medication. Alendronate and liloxifene are 2 most common anti-osteoporotic medication. Which one do I choose? Osteoporosis is a chronic disease in which bone resorption exceeds bone formation. And decrease the bone strength and increase the susceptibility to femoral fractures. There are two kinds of prescription are most prescribed, alendronate and raloxifene. Alendronate is a kind of bisphosphonate. Interestingly, bisphosphonate was used for a water softener in industrial field. However, after finding and proving the anti-osteoporotic effect, especially decreasing risk of vertebral and hip fracture risk, so alendronate was used for first-line choice of drug of osteoporosis. However, atypical femoral neck fracture, atypical femoral fracture, esophageal cancer, and osteonecrosis jaw was identified in long-term use, so these are becoming obstacles in using alendronate. In terms of raloxifene, it's a kind of a SERM. It has a decreasing risk of vertebral fractures and fewer adverse effects related to alendronate. However, in randomized control study, there's no evidence of decreasing risk of hip fractures. And observational cohort study, the sample size is limited size, so I needed a new platform to study the observational, to compare these two drugs.
So as a community, within a week, we developed a protocol to examine the risk of hip fracture in individuals taking alendronate or raloxifene. The protocol specified a new user cohort design of a population of women who were 45 years or older with a prior diagnosis of osteoporosis. These women should have had no prior exposure to bisphosphonate or raloxifene. One of the outcomes of interest, which I'll come to in a minute, hip replacement or traumatic or pathological fracture. Basically, no a priori reason why they should be having, why they should have unknown fractures. We required that they had a minimum observation period of at least a year before their first drug exposure and at least 90 days afterwards. Within this study, our primary outcome was looking at the incident risk of hip fracture. But we were also interested in the comparative effectiveness of these two drugs for vertebral fracture. And in terms of drug safety, what was the comparable risk or rate risk for atypical femoral fracture, which is believed to be an adverse event of alendronate, esophageal cancer, and osteonecrosis of the jaw. To compare these two different populations of new users, we chose to use a propensity score balance to adjust for difference between patients, survival-free model. And our time at risk was defined as 90 days after initial exposure to the drugs till end of observation, because we believe that the effects of these two drugs on decreasing fracture risk is a long duration process. Within the first 90 days, most of those fractures are probably attributable to other causes, and even after the individual stops taking the drug, they still may or may not have the protective effects. As a sensitivity analysis, we also considered a per-treatment or an on-treatment protocol. Within our study, because we are in the reproducible framework that we've developed within OHDSI, we were also able to provide a full set of diagnostics to ask, is our propensity score model actually able to adjust for differences between populations? And we could reproduce across a large number of negative controls to ask, is there still residual bias in our design because these are inherently observational studies? OHDSI is an open science community, and this study was done completely in the open, and that helped foster a huge amount of participation. Within a week, we had our protocol posted to our website, and we had extensive feedback from multiple people on how to adjust the protocol to make it more effective for the problem that we were looking at. All of the code that we used, including all the definitions, were available from the time that we started the study up to even today. Right now, you can go to Atlas on odyssey.org and pull up our treatment, our comparator, our outcome cohorts, the definitions on which they're defined, and all of the protocol-based decisions that we made in setting up this study. Oh, that's a quick thing. In terms of the data sources, our data partners provided us with results from 8 different data sets, 5 of which were claims data, including IMSP+, Optum Clinical Informatics, 3 different Truven databases, their commercial claims and encounters, Medicare and Medicaid, and electronic health record databases from Cerner, University of Texas, Columbia, and Stanford. In the table below, I've listed the total number of individuals in each of these databases within our study. And as you can see, there are about 265,000 individuals treated with alendrolate, about 40,000 treated with raloxifene. Impressively, we can look at the total time at risk. This is the time in which we're observing these patients across all of these databases. We have over 1 million person-years of observation with which to draw conclusions about the comparative effectiveness. Also, I've listed the crude rates of events of each of these outcomes across the different databases. And it's very tempting to look at those numbers and say those rates look lower for raloxifene. Perhaps raloxifene is better. But it is inappropriate in a comparative effectiveness or drug safety study to compare those crude unadjusted rates because we don't know if the populations are the same. Perhaps they're different. Maybe raloxifene users are younger. Maybe they have fewer grandchildren. Maybe they spend less time playing with their grandchildren. So we can dissect not only across each of the outcomes, but we can break it down across each of the databases. I want to draw your attention to the observation that in this study, over 97% of our patients come from the claim databases. And that has to do with sort of the size and the index period in which we were looking for individuals. As more EHRs come into the OHDSI network, moving forward, this balance should change. Now, in putting together our propensity score model to adjust for potential differences between the cohorts, one of the advantages of the reproducible OHDSI design is the ability to generate diagnostics to ask, are we really adjusting for differences between populations? And on the plot over on the top corner, what I've listed is the covariate balance. So this is the differences between the 2 different populations across tens of thousands of different features that we know about the patients before and after balancing. So before is along the x-axis, after is along the y-axis. You see a compression under the y-axis such that the maximum deviation for this Optum database is quite small. So we are doing a very good job of controlling for differences between patients. You can also look at these statistics across all of the different databases, which I've done in the table below, and you can look at the after deviation. And you see that in the EHR database, in the claims databases, where the vast majority of the data is arriving from, we achieve very good balance. The AHRs are quite small, and developing comparable groups between very small number of populations is a challenging task for us. Also, because we're running reproducible, in a reproducible framework, we're able to run over 100 different negative controls. So from the OHDSI Symposium last year, you may be familiar with the plot down at the bottom. This funnel plot lists the point estimates that we get given all of our design choices on negative controls. And if a study is well designed and has minimal bias, you will expect all those points most of those points to fall above the dashed lines. And in the Optum database, it's exactly what we've seen. This is a good design in that database. Let's take a look quickly at the results. Our primary outcome was the relative risk or hazard ratio for hip fracture. On this forest plot, for each of the rows, those are the different databases, And for each database, I've plotted the point estimate and the 95% confidence interval for the hazard ratio. As you go further over to our right, that reflects a better effect for raloxifene. Raloxifene has a lower rate, for example, of hip fracture. And if you go over to the left, it's in support of alendrolate. We can use a meta-analysis to summarize all of these values across the 10 different databases, which I've listed down at the bottom. And what you will see is there's no significant difference in the relative risk of hip fracture between patients in alendrolate versus taking raloxifene in these data. We also had several different outcomes. I'm only going to run through relatively interesting ones at the moment. The first is vertebral fracture, where we move all the way down to the summary statistics, and there's a potential protective effect for raloxifene, at least from the statistical level, but perhaps not from the clinical level. We'll leave that for a future study. Now, when your chief outcome is no significant difference between two different drugs, you run the risk of being underpowered. So one of our outcomes was a known adverse event for alendrolate. And we can think of this as a positive control. We should certainly be able to see a protective effect for raloxifene on the risk of femoral fracture if we are adequately powered. And if you move your eyes down to the summary line, you see a confidence interval, which is well away from the two being equivalent, showing that we do have power in our study to detect a difference. We do not detect a difference. They have comparable risk rates for hip fracture.
So in conclusion, no significant difference between alendronate and raloxifene in risk of hip fracture was identified, and potentially lower risk of vertebral and atypical femoral fracture risk on raloxifene. Most of all, the OHDSI community is eager and able to engage in studies to improve healthcare, and my patient should continue to play with her grandson. Thank you all, and special thanks to all of hip fracture study collaborators.